For a century, the lighthouse at Blackwater Cliffs stood in silence, a relic from another time, its walls battered by storms, its beacon long since dead. No electricity, no maintenance, no keepers, just a ruin on the edge of the world. But last night, the light came on. It started with a distress call. A cargo ship, passing through the fog, radioed the Coast Guard. Their captain was confused. "We're seeing a lighthouse up ahead, Blackwater Cliffs." Thought that place was abandoned. The operator on the other end hesitated. "It is." But the captain was certain. "Negative. I'm looking right at it. The beacon's shining like a damn searchlight." The call cut out. The ship drifted past the cliffs, never slowing down. No other crew members reported seeing the light. But the Coast Guard checked the radar. And there it was, a signal coming from Blackwater Cliffs. For the first time in 100 years, the lighthouse was active again. By morning, the locals were talking. Some said it was just a trick of the weather. Others said it was a hoax. But the fishermen who passed the cliffs that night, they saw something else. A shadow, pacing behind the lantern room windows. Someone, or something, was inside. And that's when the investigation began. For a century, the lighthouse at Blackwater Cliffs had been nothing more than a ruin. Its stone walls, once strong, were now cracked and weathered by the sea. The iron railings were rusted through, the glass windows long shattered by storms. And the beacon, the great lantern that had once saved countless sailors from the jagged coastline below, hadn't shone in 100 years. The lighthouse was dead. Until last night. It started with a report from a passing cargo ship. The SS Langley was making its way through heavy fog when the first officer spotted something ahead. A piercing white light cutting through the darkness. A lighthouse. He checked his charts, his maps, his instruments. But that was impossible. Blackwater Cliffs had been abandoned since 1924. No keepers, no power, no reason for a light to be shining. He radioed the Coast Guard. "This is SS Langley. We're approaching Blackwater Cliffs. Request confirmation. Is the lighthouse operational?" There was a long pause on the other end. Then, "Negative, Langley. That lighthouse was decommissioned a century ago." The first officer frowned, gripping the railing as he stared up at the tower, its beacon still flashing like it had never been abandoned. "Then why am I looking right at it?" Static crackled over the radio. The Coast Guard responded, their voice uncertain now. "Repeat your last, Langley." "You're seeing a beacon?" The officer hesitated, glancing at the deckhands beside him. Then, slowly, he raised his binoculars. The light was blinding. Pulsing, steady, alive. And for just a second, through the thick fog, he saw something move behind the lantern room window. A shadow, a figure, watching them. The officer's stomach turned to ice. He lowered the binoculars, swallowing hard. His hand shot to the radio. "There's someone up there." Silence. Then, the lighthouse beacon cut out. The ship plunged into darkness. The first officer's heart pounded in his chest. He looked back up at the tower, expecting to see the figure still standing behind the glass. But now, there was nothing. Just a dead, crumbling lighthouse, as if the light had never been on at all. By morning, the Coast Guard launched an investigation. Locals swore no one had entered the lighthouse in decades. The entrance was still locked, from the inside. But that night, fishermen near the cliffs saw something else. A faint glow from the tower, a whisper beneath the waves. And behind the broken lantern room glass, a shape moving. The light had returned, and so had whatever was inside. The last lighthouse keeper of Blackwater Cliffs was Arthur Grayson. In 1924, he vanished without a trace. His final radio transmission was logged on October 12th, just after midnight. His last words, "There's something outside, watching me. If anyone hears this, don't let it in." Then, silence. By the time the rescue team arrived the next morning, the lighthouse was empty. The door was locked from the inside. The lantern room was cold, the oil reserves untouched. But Grayson was gone. The official report blamed the storm that had rolled in that night. Winds strong enough to rip a man from the tower, waves that could have dragged him into the sea. But the locals didn't believe it. They knew the stories. Blackwater Cliffs had always been cursed. Even before the lighthouse was built, sailors avoided the area. Compasses spun wild. Strange lights flickered over the water. And sometimes, on windless nights, a low knocking could be heard on the rocks below, a steady, patient rhythm, as if someone was waiting to be let inside. A diary was found in Grayson's quarters. Its pages were torn, water damaged, but one sentence appeared over and over, filling the margins. "The light keeps them away. The light must never go out." The final entry was dated the night before he disappeared. The ink was smudged, as if his hand had been shaking. I saw it again tonight, the shape beyond the glass. It knows I'm alone now. If the light fails, they will come. Grayson was never found. The lighthouse was shut down shortly after. The government called it a hazard, an unnecessary expense. But the locals knew the truth. They let the building rot, let the walls crumble, let the storms claim it. Because without the light, nothing could keep whatever was outside from coming in. And now, a century later, the beacon was shining again. Which meant only one thing: something had returned. The Coast Guard had no choice. After the reports from the cargo ship, after the light had returned, they sent a team to investigate. 3 men, a historian, a local officer, and an engineer. They reached Blackwater Cliffs just after sunset. The lighthouse loomed over them, its rusted frame barely holding together, its stone walls slick with centuries of ocean mist. The beacon pulsed, slow and steady, a heartbeat of light. And as they approached the entrance, the door was open. The air inside was wrong. Thick, heavy, like the building itself was holding its breath. Dust coated the floor, untouched for decades. Cobwebs hung from the rafters, stretching in the corners of the stairwell. But there was no sign of footprints, no sign that anyone had entered this place in 100 years. And yet, the lamp in the lantern room was burning. The engineer rushed to check the wiring. There was no power source, no working generator, no fuel in the tanks. Nothing. And yet, the light was on. And the strangest part, the oil lamp's wick hadn't burned down at all. The flame danced like it had just been lit. But it was impossible. The historian moved toward the keeper's desk, running his hands over the dust-covered journals, the remnants of Arthur Grayson's final years. But before he could open one, the officer called out from the stairwell. "There's a radio up here, and it's still running." The team gathered around the old radio. It was an antique, its wires frayed, the dials rusted in place. And yet, the static hummed through the speakers. Software constant, like someone had been trying to make contact. The historian reached out, adjusted the frequency. For a second, there was silence, then a voice, faint, crackling, barely above a whisper. "Don't turn it off." The officer stumbled back. "What the hell was that?" The historian twisted the dial again. Static. Nothing. But just as they turned to leave, the air changed, the light flickered, the room went dark, and from somewhere below, a door slammed shut. They weren't alone. The blackout only lasted a second. The light flared back on, flooding the lantern room with its cold, mechanical glow. But now, something was different. The radio was still running. The static was louder now, like something was pressing against the signal. The historian turned the dial. The voice returned, this time clearer. "If the light goes out..." A crackle of static cut the sentence short. Then, another voice, not a whisper. A knock. The team froze. The sound had come from below. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. The officer's hand hovered over his gun. Someone else is here. But the historian shook his head. No one could have gotten in. We'd have heard them. The engineer was already backing toward the stairs. "I don't care. We need to go. Now." But the historian wasn't listening. He was staring at the radio logs, a thick, dust-covered ledger beside the ancient transmitter. And that's when he saw the dates. The lighthouse was never fully abandoned. Every few years, someone had been sent to maintain it. A name, a year, a brief note. And beside every entry, one word: missing. The last recorded entry was from 1987, a government engineer named Daniel Marsh. The final note in the ledger: "If the light ever comes back on, do not turn it off." The historian's blood ran cold. He flipped back through the older pages. Every keeper before Arthur Grayson. Every name was crossed out. Every final note said the same thing: the light keeps them away. The light must never go out. The historian turned to the engineer, his voice sharp. "We can't shut it off." The engineer froze. "What?" The historian grabbed the radio logs, holding them up. This lighthouse was never about guiding ships. It was keeping something trapped. The officer tensed. Then what happens if the light dies? The historian swallowed hard. Then, from below the tower, a second knock, then a third, then dragging. Something heavy, something wet scraping against the stone. Something that had been waiting. The knocking stopped. For a moment, the only sound was the distant roar of waves crashing against the cliffs. Then, the light flickered, just once. A brief sputter, barely noticeable. Then, again, the engineer cursed under his breath. "This isn't possible," he muttered, scrambling toward the power panel. "There's no electricity, no fuel source. This thing shouldn't even be on." The historian still clutched the radio logs, his eyes darting to the last words written in the book. "If the light ever comes back on, do not turn it off." The officer spoke, voice sharp. "What happens when it goes out?" No one answered, but something outside did. A new sound joined the wind. A low hum, not mechanical, not natural. Something beneath the waves, something rising. The engineer was frantic now. He ripped open the old electrical panel, scanning the wires, trying to understand what was powering the lighthouse. There was nothing there. No batteries, no generators, no power source at all. The light was running on nothing, and it was failing. The humming outside grew louder. The historian stepped back from the lantern room's windows, his fingers gripping the desk. The officer pulled out his flashlight, turning toward the stairwell. Then, a final flicker, and the light died. The world outside fell into absolute darkness. The ocean went silent. The humming stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, boom, boom, boom. Something knocked on the lighthouse door, slow, deliberate, louder than before. The officer raised his gun, aiming toward the stairwell. "We need to leave." The historian shook his head. "We can't." The officer's voice was tight. "Why?" The historian swallowed. "Because it's inside." From the bottom of the lighthouse, the knocking started again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the outside. It was coming from the walls, from the stairs below, from the rafters above. A deep, slow, dragging sound, like something crawling up from the foundation. The air turned ice cold. The engineer's breath hitched. "I think," he whispered, "I think it's coming up the stairs." Then, from just beyond the stairwell door, a voice, not human, not a whisper, a guttural, rasping breath. "Who put the light back on?" The officer fired a shot. The sound rang through the tower, but it hit nothing. The engineer scrambled back, gripping the table. The historian clutched the radio logbook, his hands shaking. Then, the dragging stopped. The air was still. For 5 long seconds, no one moved. Then, the door handle began to turn. Slow, precise. Something was letting itself in. The radio crackled to life one last time. The old static, shifting, glitching. Then, Arthur Grayson's voice, the last lighthouse keeper. A message from 100 years ago. "You should have kept the light on." Then, the door opened, and the screaming began.